Hi everybody, this is a VR in response to the Markwood Mens Breakfast Club's question about family traditions. First of all, the housework. I'm smoking one of my Cobbett pipes, and in it I've got Dunhill Nightcap. It's a lovely blend that I really enjoy when I'm looking for a nice comfortable smoke. I really enjoyed the video that you put up when you were talking about your family traditions. And I began to sort of think about my own family and did we have any traditions? Now, I can't think of any that we did. We were sort of quite an odd family. I'm not sure my parents liked life that much. They certainly didn't seem to produce any traditions or anything like that. It was more a sense of getting through each day and that kind of thing. But one thing that happened every year was that my uncle and his family came down to stay with us. We lived near Great Yarmouth, which was a seaside town, typically traditional seaside town with all the trimmings, you know, the rock factory, the bloater fish factory, where people went and bought kippers to send on to friends. The seaside was near, and all the slotman machines and that kind of thing. And my uncle was a disabled man. He'd had polio as a young boy and spent his early life at one of the homes that gave disabled people a living, in a sense. They trained them in something, and he was trained as a shoemaker and shoe repairer. But when they came down, it was the annual holidays, so he came down for a fortnight usually, stayed with us because it was cheaper, and then each day catch the bus into Great Yarmouth or whatever they were going to do. But one thing we always did each year was we'd go to the wrestling. Mum, Auntie Hazel, and my uncle, and Dad and myself, and we'd go, and the two women and my uncle would sit on the front row, and Dad and myself would sit somewhere further back because we didn't want to be associated with them. Not because we didn't like them, but because invariably they'd start braying hell out of some wrestler who fell out of the ring or something like that, especially if they thought he was being dirty. Beard talked about the wrestling, talked about it being fixed, and in a sense it was. But in another sense it wasn't. It was freestyle wrestling, and the guys were very good at the moves that they did. I once saw a guy called Prince Kumali. He was fighting a man, and the man's shoulder blade got accidentally dislocated. And Prince Kumali, I think, must have been a doctor or something like that, because during the break he went across and put the man's shoulder back in, much to the surprise of the wrestler, who found it a very painful experience and ended up cursing him and calling him all the names under the sun in a racist way. So Prince Kumali slowly looked at him and then put his shoulder out again and said, "Right, you put it back," and just got out of the ring. But on this particular day, my aunt and my mother and my uncle were sat there. It was during the break interval between the matches, and Dad said to me, "Come on, we'll go get an ice cream." So we wandered off to get ice creams or to have a look around. I think it was the day that we stood by the dressing room door and I was allowed to talk to the wrestlers as they went in. A bit more of that later. There was one wrestler called Jim Hussey. He was a big man in every sense of the word. But he was a dirty wrestler. He had the reputation of being a bit nasty. And he'd been wrestling earlier on in the evening and had got dressed and was leaving the theatre. And behind my mum was this gangway that he was walking up. And he must have heard my mother and my aunt talking about him. And we, as we got nearer, heard my mother saying, "That bloody Jim Hussey, he's nothing but piss and wind. He's a dirty wrestler." And they were going on, and my mother was getting quite derogatory about him. But when he heard her say he's nothing but piss and wind, he was laughing like anything behind her, and then just slowly walked off without saying a word. And it was Dad who tapped Mum on the shoulder and said, "Do you know who stood behind you when you were talking?" And she said, "No, who?" And he said, "Jim Hussey." And my mum and aunt sort of went bright red and realised that they'd been overheard. There was a wrestler called Les Kellett, and he was a sort of comedian as well as a wrestler, in the sense that he would do things like talk to the referee whilst he was stood on the face or the hand of the wrestler that was laying on the floor. And eventually it'd be noticed and the referee would point down and Jim Hussey would go, "Oh, I am sorry," and get sort of quite, "Oh, I'm really sorry." And one wrestler was getting madder and madder at Les Kellett. And Les just held him by the face and just kissed him on the forehead gently before he laid him out. But he was a really, really tough man. He'd had several back operations and his back was a mess. But he still wrestled. And his timing in everything was just wonderful. He'd fall through the ropes and one foot would go up and just catch the rope. And the next minute he'd be back in the ring. He would do all sorts of things like that. But he had a trick that he used to grab them by the hands, twist it, put them on the floor and stamp on them very quickly on his opponent's hands. And one night we were in a pub in the town where I was brought up, Otley. And there were the coalman's sons who were the local toughs. They were always getting into trouble. And they were doing this in the pub. And they did it to a fairly old guy in the pub. And Les Kellett walked in, but nobody recognised him because he was sort of just dressed in ordinary clothes, cloth cap on, looking a very sort of bent old man. And he came up to Paul, one of the lads, and said, "Can I try that?" And Paul said, "Oh, go away, Grandad, we don't want to hurt you." And he said, No, come on, I'd like to have a go. And Paul said, "All right," and sort of was going to do it. And before he knew it, Les Kellett had jumped up and down on his hands 2 or 3 times. We never saw him do that, never saw the boy do that again, and to anybody else in the pub. But one of my favourite wrestlers, a really good wrestler, was a guy, Johnny Da Silva. He was a Maori wrestler, and he had all the traditional tattoos on him, on his face and on his chest. And this particular night, Dad and I were stood by the entrance to the dressing rooms, and and Johnny Da Silva was coming in from having fought a match, and I reached up to touch his tattoos, and they were all raised and stuff, very strange. But he stopped and turned and looked at me, and smiled and just said, good evening, lad, are you all right? And I said, yes, but daren't speak to him, really. So he carried on into the dressing room. But I've never, ever forgotten the touch of those tattoos, what they felt like. Seems an odd thing to remember, an odd thing to do, but these men were my heroes. They were the men who could take care of themselves, and yet were usually very gentle outside the ring. So whilst it's not a tradition, it's something I remember, and the wrestling happened every year when my uncle used to go and come down. But just to tell you what kind of a man my uncle was, he had a wicked sense of humour. And due to his illness, he had a hump back, and wind used to get trapped in his chest. Or, lower down. And he'd let it go. But every time he did, he'd turn to the person behind him and say, "You dirty devil," with a look of shock on his face. And everybody else would look at the poor man behind him or the poor woman behind him and sort of think, what a terrible thing, Or he'd be walking along, and if he wanted to get somewhere quickly, he'd tap the ankle of the person in front with his walking stick, which was incredibly painful. And they usually spun round to sort of either hit him or swear at him. But he sort of looked so innocent. "Oh, I am very sorry. I'm so clumsy, And invariably the person would say, "Look, you go ahead, And he'd get to where he wanted to be. I think of him a lot because he had a wicked sense of humour. I remember when I was little and when I really didn't understand things, he came down with a box and he was carrying it proudly, and it was quite a big box. And his wife was carrying the cases, but he was carrying this box. And my mother said, "What have you got there?" And I remember him saying, "Contraceptives." And she said, "How long are you down here for?" He said, "Well, only 2 weeks, but I think I'll probably have enough." And sort of wandered into the house. But my mother was very house proud, and she polished the floors like glory so that they shone. The only trouble was the carpet slipped all over the place, and often Roy ended up on the floor more times than he walked across it, at which point he would swear at Mum and sort of, eventually I think she got the message and didn't polish the floor when Roy was coming. But I'll end there and look forward to tomorrow's question. May you all be richly blessed, and may your God go with you.